Yeah, good morning. So, last session we learned about how we can design components using commands, and we learned about how do we apply some bootstrap and design. So, after understanding setting up bootstrap and installing, now in Angular we need to discuss all other concepts related to components. So first important in Angular, you need to know about data binding. So in Angular, how we can handle data binding. Actually, data binding is nothing but uh, data binding. Data binding is a technique used in web applications. It is a technique used in web applications that defines how the data is binded to UI. That defines how data is binded to UI. That means how we can collect the data and display in the UI. Generally, if you learn JavaScript, jQuery, all these, for example, suppose I will take an ordinary HTML page. I have an ordinary HTML page. In this, there is an ordered list, or there is a div. Now here we have some data. I'm creating a script. Okay. So here we have some data. Data is, suppose I have some data that is a string type, number type, or something. So data contains some name, so TV, and price, some price. Like this, I have some data. Just ordinary string it is. Now I need to display this data in this div. So that is what actually data binding is. Data binding means collect the data and bind to UI. How JavaScript does? In JavaScript, what we use for data binding, what we need for data binding, to access this data and display in this UI, what is the technique we have to use? In JavaScript and jQuery, actually, JavaScript and jQuery uses browser events. JavaScript and jQuery uses browser events and DOM manipulations. Browser events and DOM manipulations to bind data. JavaScript and jQuery depends on a lot of browser events and DOM manipulation. Compulsory. Without browser events, without DOM manipulation, you cannot bind the data. That means what you have to do, actually, browser events means you have to write a function body load. That means when body loads, so body load means we have a body on load is equal to body load. When body loads, what this function have to do? It have some data stored. We need to bind that data. Then it should depend on event and it should depend on DOM manipulation. DOM manipulation means document dot query selector, and what is the element div. In the div inner HTML, we need to apply the data. That is how we do. So that means it depends on lot of DOM manipulations. So, and events. We need DOM manipulations and events. By using DOM manipulations and events, the data binding is handled. In JavaScript and jQuery, this is the technique that you follow. That's general thing. So, data binding is, you have some data, which is a string or a number or an array or an object or something. Now you need to bind it to the user interface, collect the data and bind. Generally, we have to do this all in JavaScript and jQuery. So compulsory, you need event. This data need to be binded into this div. Then we have to write event on load, body load, and on body load we have to write a function body load. What we have to do, document dot query selector. What is the query selector? Div. In the div inner HTML, we have to display the data. That is how we need to access the data and display the data. We need to access the data and display the data. That's what generally we do in JavaScript. In JavaScript, the DOM manipulations and events are required. Now it can access this and it can display that here. It is displaying it. So accessing the data and displaying the UI, that is what actually data binding. And JavaScript and jQuery completely depends on this. DOM manipulations and events, compulsory. You need event. You have to tell on click, on change, on load, anything. And you need DOM methods. So get element by ID or query selector or anything. But what Angular will do is, one of the advantages, Angular uses frameworks like MVC and MVVM for data binding. It uses frameworks like MVC and MVVM. What is advantage is, Angular frameworks are completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. They are completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. You don't need any DOM manipulations. It is completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. So Angular uses frameworks which doesn't require any DOM manipulations. And also it doesn't require events every time. Events are required, but not every time. Without events, without DOM manipulations, Angular can handle data binding. How it can handle data binding is by using MVC and MVVM. So you can simply say that MVC and MVVM are used for data binding in Angular. They manage data binding in Angular. What is MVC? What is MVVM? I will give a simple example. So what is MVC? What is MVVM? We will see that. Because Angular is using these frameworks in specially data binding. What is MVC? I will just give you an idea actually. MVC is a model view controller. Actually, MVC, it is an software architectural pattern. MVC is an software architectural pattern. Generally, what is meant by architectural pattern? Actually, an architectural pattern can build and control the application flow, In software development, you will come across with two types of patterns. One is design patterns, another one is software architectural patterns. Design patterns are used in building application. Application is built by using design patterns. But they are not enough to control the application flow. That means from where to where transport the data, how to send the data and all this. For that we need architectural patterns. Architectural patterns are responsible for controlling the application flow. We will not go into design patterns detail because that is a very different and big concept. Actually, in software development, everything is a design pattern. In software development, we follow certain design patterns in building application. Everything is a design pattern. For example, if you learnt about JavaScript events, if anybody asked you as an experienced person, can you tell which design pattern event follows? Which design pattern event follows? Majority of people don't know about that. But an experienced developer should know which design pattern it follows. I hope you learnt in your JavaScript, event follows a design pattern. Event follows a design pattern called observer. Event follows a design pattern called observer. Observer is a communication pattern. How an event communicates with its function. That is called observer. This is very high level. That means even at a 10 years experience level developer, we can ask this question. That, okay, you are 10 years experienced web developer, then I will ask you something about design patterns. So that means which design pattern it is following. For example, you may have learnt like suppose for. So you might have learnt for in. So and for off like this. What is difference between for in, for off? Actually, for is a loop. For in, for off are iterators. For in is a loop and for in, for off are iterators. What is meant by iterator? Iterator means it is a software design pattern that uses a sequential order of accessing elements from collection. If anyone asks what is meant by iterator, the name iterator is because of the design pattern. Iterator is the name of a design pattern. What is the design pattern? The ability of reading elements from a collection in sequential order without initialization, without condition, without counter. You don't need initialization, you don't need condition, you don't need counter. For example, if you are writing for requires an initialization. Initialization means I equal to 0. For requires a condition, I less than 10. For requires a counter, I plus plus. But iterators don't need that. Iterators, I hope you know, for var item of collection. You don't need initialization, you don't need condition, you don't need counter. It will read everything in sequential order one by one, and it will stop when it is finished. So iterator is a word which is actually design pattern. So in software development, we build applications by following certain design patterns. We follow certain design patterns. We follow certain design patterns. By using those design patterns, we build the application. We build the application. But design patterns are responsible for only building application. And so many design patterns are there. I will just give you an overview. I will not go in detail into that. A simple overview I will give. Actually, these are the design patterns. Design patterns are the solutions for software design problems. That means we build application by using design patterns, and actually in software development, we have 23 design patterns. We call them as gang of four design patterns. These 23 design patterns are categorized into three groups: creational, structural, behavioral. Creational patterns deal with object creation mechanism, how an object is created. Structural patterns deal with designing of classes. That means how classes are created, right? And behavioral patterns deal with how communication is handled. So technically, design patterns deal with all these things. Structural pattern, see, these are all design patterns actually. Creational patterns means all these: abstract, factory, builder, factory method, prototype. I hope if you learned Java, .NET like technologies, C++, you heard singleton. You might have worked with the pattern called singleton. Singleton pattern means only one object can be created for a class. You need to design a class in such a way that only one object can be created for it. Multiple objects cannot be created, only one. That is singleton. So everything is design pattern. But these design patterns are responsible for only building application. To control application flow, these are all structural patterns. These are all behavioral patterns. Architectural patterns are bigger. Architectural patterns not only building application, but also control the application flow. Controlling the application flow means how to accept input, how to process that input, how to generate output, how to send that to the client, how to communicate with the database, get the data from the data, present the data. That means it is about taking input from user, process, how to generate, from where to where, transport the data. All this is done by architectural patterns. And these are all architectural patterns. Blackboard system, broker pattern, event-driven architecture, implicit invocation, layers, microservices, MVC, MVP, MVVM. These are all architectural patterns. In software development, a software developer must know all this. That means because you are learning Java, you are learning .NET, any technology you are learning at a higher level, a developer is not a developer if he don't know about any of the architectural patterns. Compulsory. You learn Java and you go to companies, they will first ask you which framework you learned in Java, what frameworks you learned, right? That means Java people learn framework like Spring, Hibernate and all this. Why they need to learn a framework? They learned already a language. Language will teach you how to build the application. But a framework will teach you how to control the application flow. These days, across all technologies, very popular frameworks are microservices and MVC. MVC, microservices, these two are very much trending. All technologies use it. It is not only that Java, .NET, all technologies use these frameworks. We have microservices in Java, .NET and all. We have MVC in Java, .NET, PHP, Python, everywhere we have. So what is an architectural pattern? Architectural pattern is responsible for building application and controlling the application flow. These are all architectural patterns, various architectural patterns. So this is a big concept. Actually, MVC is an architectural pattern. MVC that we can say TriGUE introduced MVC in early 1970s. In early 1970s with a language called Smalltalk. First MVC was introduced in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, TriGUE introduced, we call him father of MVC. He introduced the concept of MVC. The main purpose of MVC is code separation and reusability. Code separation and reusability issues, the concerns were there. The main concern was code reusability and code separation. To achieve code reusability and code separation, he introduced a framework called MVC, the model, view, and controller. How it works, I will show you. A basic point I will show you. Actually, TriGUE was working for a British oil corporation company for a project. In the early 1970s, he was working on a desktop application which belongs to British Petroleum. He was working on desktop application. In that application, he faced some problems. The problem is nothing but, so he have to work with user interface and he have to work with the logic and he need to work with data. Three things were there: user interface, the logic, and the data. And everything is combined at one place. It is difficult to handle. Everything present at one location, it is difficult to handle. Then TriGUE introduced a concept called, he introduced a framework. So controller, he introduced the concept of model and the concept of view. He introduced the concept of model, view, controller. What we can do is, this data, whatever data, model represents the data. Model represents the data. That means the data is kept, data is configured and kept in model. And the logic, application logic, is kept in the controller. And user interface is in the UI. That means now application cleanly separates everything. Model contains data and controller contains the logic, application logic, and view contains the user interface. That means whatever the data comes, from view, it will take input and send to controller. Controller will send into the model. And whatever data is in the model, it will come to controller, and from controller it will send to the view. Directly, there is no communication between model and view. We don't have any communication between model and view. That means data will not go from model to view. It have to go through controller. Data will not directly go from view to model. It have to go through the controller. That is what we call as MVC. In MVC, the application is separated into three major layers. So the view, the controller, and the model. Model represents data, controller represents application logic, and view defines user interface. So the main concern is code separation and code reusability. This was introduced by TriGUE and it was first used in Smalltalk. Later, all technologies started using MVC. So various technologies are using MVC. Various technologies are using this MVC. Like Java uses MVC by name Spring. PHP uses MVC by name Cake PHP and Code Igniter. Python uses MVC by name Django Flask. So, and Ruby uses MVC by name Ruby on Rails, right? And .NET uses MVC by name ASP.NET MVC. And where JavaScript uses MVC by name Spine, JavaScript Spine. And of course, JavaScript based application. That means even Angular is using MVC. Angular also using MVC. Angular is a framework, so we don't need to keep this. Angular is using not only MVC, it is MVC and MVV. JavaScript based frameworks means Spine, Angular comes under that. Angular is using that. Angular is using, Backbone is using, so many technologies are using. Angular JS, Backbone, Angular, Knockout JS, all these are using MVC. Now, what is advantage of this MVC is the main advantage of using this framework. Framework doesn't require events. That doesn't depend on events. Framework doesn't depend on DOM manipulations. But unfortunately, React don't have that. In React also, we have data binding, but in React also, it has to depend on DOM methods. Angular completely decoupled from DOM. That means you have to forget everything like get element by ID, tag name, class name, not required. Without that, you can easily bind and you can easily handle the data. So technically, various technologies are using this framework. So what is MVC? So MVC stands for Model View Controller. So what is model? Technically, what is model? Actually, model, it represents the data we are working with. It represents the data we are working with. Model represents the data we are working with. So technically, in JavaScript based environment, actually model means data. So that means JavaScript based. JavaScript based means data will be data. JavaScript based data will be in which format? JSON. Here data means it will be in the format of JSON. JavaScript object notation. That means it can be any type of data. I am now taking with regard to Angular. Right? When you learn about MVC in Java, MVC in .NET, different points will come. Here we are discussing related to Angular and JavaScript. Right? In JavaScript, what is meant data? Data means it will be in the form of an object, JSON. So it represents the data. That means actually model represents the business requirements. Business requirements will use the data requirements actually. So technically, model is representing data. Model contains data. That means it contains data and data validations. It not only containing data, it also contains data validations. That means it can even verify what kind of data you are trying to store. It can restrict the data. That means it is asking for number and you are sending some string. It can prevent that. It can validate the data. So model contains data. In simple point, model contains data. Now what controller contains? Controller is nothing but it defines application specific logic. It defines application specific logic. That means it controls the overall communication between model and view. That means it is the core component in MVC. The entire communication between view and model is managed by whom? Controller. Controller is responsible for entire communication between model and view. So from view, data will come to controller. From controller, it will go to model. From model, data will come to controller. From controller, it will go to view. That means the entire communication is managed by controller. That means you have user interface. From user interface, see, already you know in JavaScript based. Suppose we have certain data. So we have data. Suppose we have name. So we have price. We have some data. Now this is what we call as model. Model contains the data. Now this data need to be presented in the UI. It is to be presented in the UI. That means here I want to present the data. So name, and here I want to display TV. I want to present price, like data terms and data definition. I want to present like this, some data. Now already you saw that it is not simply presented. Actually this data comes to controller. Am I right? It comes to controller. Controller will decide when and where to bind the data. Controller will decide when or where to bind the data. That means where to bind the data to be binded into this location. Actually, what is it? For example, in HTML, we have a data list, we have data term, we have data definitions. That means now controller is responsible for handling this. So accessing the data from the model and bind the data to the UI. Again, if there is a text box and you are sending some data from here, if you are sending data here, then this data will come to controller. Controller will update that into the model. Directly, data will not go from view to model and model to view. The mediator is controller. Controller is responsible for controlling the overall flow. Without controller also we can do. That is MVVM. That is another framework. Later, next level I will tell you. So first we will see how this MVC works. How the model, how the view and the controller works. That means Angular is internally using that framework. So you don't need to depend on much DOM manipulations. It's very simple. Here, controller is that. Another one, we have view. View describes, it defines the user interface. It defines the user interface. So actually in Angular application, so view is HTML. Am I right? It is a template in Angular. So view is HTML. That means it is a component. It is a component or template. It is a component or template. That component and template will take your data and handle interaction with it. Interaction means user interface. Who is providing UI? User interface is provided by component or template through HTML. HTML is responsible for managing that and handling that. This is basically how it is going to work. Now we will see how this works in our application. That means how this MVC works, how Angular uses this MVC. Here one more point is there. Okay, we are clear that Angular is not using DOM manipulations and events. Angular is completely depending on frameworks. One is MVC, another one MVV. What is MVC? I explained. Now here again, actually Angular data binding is handled by using MVC. Angular data binding is handled by using MVC or MVVM, MVC or MVVM. So that is clear. Data binding is handled by using MVC or MVVM. Actually, they use various approaches. They use various approaches. We have different data binding approaches. What are the data binding approaches? We have a data binding approach called interpolation. We have property binding and we have attribute binding. That means again, MVC, MVVM have three approaches. They use interpolation, property binding, and attribute binding. Data binding is done by MVC and MVVM. In MVC, MVVM, again, three techniques are there. We have interpolation, and we have property binding, and we have attribute binding. What is interpolation? Actually, interpolation is nothing but it is a data binding technique. It is a data binding technique where the model data is binded to UI by using data binding expression. What is data binding expression? Already we know data binding expression is double curly brace. This is data binding expression. This mechanism is called interpolation. If you are binding by using data binding expression, then it is called as, we call it as interpolation. Interpolation is a technique where we bind the data by using this data binding expression. Let's see how this interpolation works. Let's go to the project, and here in components, I will open the components in terminal. Okay, let's create one component, ng generate component data binding. Skip test. I'm creating data binding component without any testing. Data binding component is ready. So we designed data binding component. Let's keep this in startup. Means for every example, I will take separate component for you so that you can clearly understand. Now we will make that in the startup. We will start with which component? Data binding component. So in index.html also, we have to set that data binding. Usually its selector name will be the same name as you given for the component. Now let's run this and see. And data binding is working fine. Okay, it is working. Let's go to the logic now. We will go to data binding component.ts. And here we are maintaining the data. And remember, actually, data can come from a separate external source, like generally we call as APIs. From API, we can bring the data. That I will tell you in next level, how to bring data from external source, APIs, and use. Currently, what we are doing, we will keep the data in the class itself. Later, we will learn how to bring the data from APIs, how to work with them and deal. As of now, data we will keep in the class. Remember, this is the controller. Actually, data may come from some external source. We will try that. Suppose external source. You learned JavaScript. In JavaScript, how to get data from an API. I hope you have learned in JavaScript to communicate and bring data from API. We have a fetch method. Fetch method. Fetch is a JavaScript method which is used for interacting with the APIs. In JavaScript, we use fetch method for fetching the data from any API. For example, I will show you one small example. You see, suppose we have some website like Fake Store API. This is a website. Fake Store API is a website. These people will provide you, Fake Store API people will provide you some sample APIs. You can practice several examples on these APIs because in real world, Angular is interacting everything with API data. So later we will create our own APIs also, but this is ready-made API, Fake Store API. You see, these people will provide some methods like products of one categories. You click on the products, it will return all the products data. You know, it is a JSON, right? Suppose I clicked here products of one. Products of one means it will get everything here. So you see, this is one ID number one. It is displaying ID number one. And see, what does this curly brace indicates? That it is an object. You know, JavaScript objects. And in that object, it is ID, title. These are the details we are having. This is the API. Copy it. That is the API URL. Now I want to display this in my Angular application. This data I want to display in Angular application. So see that how to do it. You can have data directly in your class, but this is controller. This class is controller. What this controller is doing? So this controller is using, I don't need to worry about these constructors and all. We will directly write a method. What it is doing is, we are using a fetch method. We are using a fetch method. But when this fetch method should work, when the component is initialized and the component is created, we have to perform this fetch. So what you do is, there is a method called onInit. OnInit means when component is initialized. Later you are going to learn about these events, life cycle. I already told you, because when you are adding a component by using commands, automatically life cycle events are generated. These life cycle events we will discuss in a separate session. OnInit indicates at the time of initializing component what actions to perform. So here I will write onInit, we will write fetch method. Fetch is a JavaScript method used for interacting and fetching the data from API. And as you know that fetch uses the request, it is http://fakestoreapi.com and slash in that products in that /1. This is going to return one object. Okay. And fetch is a promise actually. Promise in JavaScript means it uses then. Then that means if it is successful, then it uses a callback function. That callback function, that means actually I can write in a shortcut. That means it will use a callback function. What this callback function will do, it will get the response. Response is whatever data it is returned. It will get the response, and this response we will return. This response is returned because fetch method returns the data in binary form. In binary form, we have to convert that data into response.json form. Otherwise, data will be in binary form. That is what you have learned in JavaScript. If anybody asked what is difference between JavaScript fetch and jQuery AJAX, because jQuery AJAX will fetch the APIs. JavaScript fetch also will fetch the API. What is difference between JavaScript and jQuery? So many differences are there, right? In JavaScript, we fetch the data from any API by using this fetch method. But problem is, it is in the form of binary. We have to convert into JSON. After converting into JSON, now we need to use another then method. This method will use a callback function that collects the JSON data. Whatever JSON data is returned by the previous method, it will return it. In JavaScript, we call as promises, and in promises, this is called chaining of promises. If anybody asked, you learned JavaScript, do you know a promise? Can you give an example of promise in JavaScript? Fetch is the best example of promise. In JavaScript, fetch is the best example for promise. It is responsible for handling interaction with the API. It is returning the data and which is converted into JSON. After that, we collect that returned data, and this data we need to present in the UI. Now what controller is doing? It is accessing data from an API. That means that API is our model. Our data is currently coming from model. From model, we collected the data and stored inside this data. This need to be presented. What we can do here now, see, we will create here a property called product. Product is a property. This product, remember, this is a class, right? In a class, this is a property. It is any type. And we are expecting an object. It is a property with any type. We are expecting an object because this is returning an object. Data is returning an object. You see here, it is returning an object. So we are expecting an object. So this is object, and what we have to do, assign this data to that object. Now how do we access? We have to use this dot product, right? We need to access this dot product, and we need to present it. Now very important, it is presented inside the data. That means it is using the callback function. This is the data, right? This data we need to present, but it is an object now. It is an object. We can directly present the data, or we can configure the data in any resource. For example, temporarily, to make you understand, I will do one thing. See, I am just using console.log. Okay. Console.log, I am just presenting whatever data we collected. Console log means you know that it is going to define that. So you see here, I will run this. It is working. Right click, inspect, go to console and see. You see the console, and it is having an object that contains the data. That means we are fetching the data. Coming from that API. And that is an object. It is returning an object which contains category, ID, name, so many details are there. Now this data need to be presented in the UI. This is data binding. If you don't know about anything related to APIs, fetching data from API in JavaScript, this becomes a lot of confusion. Because this is actually JavaScript fetch method. By using JavaScript fetch method, we fetch the data from API and interact with it. So you can do one thing. If in the beginning days, if it is very complex to handle API, first we will hard code some data here itself directly. So that will be more easy for you to understand. Like how to hard code. This is coming, right? Data is coming. I showed you how it is presented, right? Keep it aside. That means just keep it aside. We will use this in another level. What you do is temporarily, because I can see many people's face blank because they don't know proper JavaScript fetch method, right? I can understand that you don't have any knowledge of fetch or anything. So better for your level currently, what you have to do is you first create a simple so product, and this product is what type, any type, it is an object. In this object you put some data. For example, we have id and it contains so one. We have some title. Title contains some name, and we have some price. So this price contains some data. This is how first you try. Then I will tell you about APIs and all, fetching data and API, because working with API is the ultimate real world scenario how to do, right? But in real world, we have to work with all APIs only. And if you don't know JavaScript API methods, at least in Angular, you have to learn them. So I will not go that much complex in the first example. First, what we will do, simple, what to do, create one object, product. This object we have to present in the UI. So how to present in the UI? Let's see. We will go to HTML page. UI is HTML. In HTML, we have to present the data. So I will design a div and I will put here a container fluid. This is a Bootstrap. I will create a heading, product details. And here we will create a data list, data term, name, and a data definition. Another data term, price. Another data definition. Another data term is ID. At the top, I will give as ID. So we have another one is ID. Data term ID and data definition. So what we need to do is, whatever data is present in this ID, we need to bring and display here. Then actually what you saw in JavaScript, on load, on click, on change, some events you have to write, get element by ID, get query selector, and display inside this data definition. But now we are using interpolation technique. Interpolation technique means simply, so here interpolation technique is simply, we are using a binding expression. We are using a binding expression, and here we are accessing that object. What is the object name? Product. Product object have a property. What is that? ID. That we will do here. That's very simple. No events, no DOM manipulations, nothing. Whatever data is kept, we have to just access that and bind it here. This is by using interpolation technique. You can see that now data is working. Now how to get the name? That's very simple. You have to just use the binding that is present in what? Product dot title, and it will get the product name and display. Later I will tell you APIs, because first you try this basic, then you can go with APIs and all, because first level itself, if you are not having proper knowledge of JavaScript and APIs, you can't handle such examples. So better first you try this. You put some data in your class and you access the data and bind it here. What is it? Another one, product dot, what is it? Price. We need to access that price and display. And very important, you already know JavaScript is case sensitive, capitalization matters, everything you have to follow correctly. That means how you define the product here, how you define the properties here, in the same way you have to access. Now this is interpolation. Interpolation is a technique where we just access the data and display the data. Now here one problem is there. I will give you, this is interpolation, it is working fine. I will give you a syntax. For example, we have product. Product is any type. In that we have name as TV like this, and I need to bind this, I need to display here. Then we have to just use a binding expression, and we need to access product dot name. right? I will give the current example what I done. Example. So here first step, add a new component, and the component is ng generate component. I given data binding. Okay, skip test everything you do, right? Next, data binding dot component dot ts. In this data binding component dot ts, you don't need to do much. You have to just add only this. That means in the class you need to keep that content. And how to present it? You have to go to data binding dot component dot html. In html you have to just present like this. This is the first example. Means APIs we will see next level, because first let it make it very, very simple. Put some data, access it and display it. That's it, right? This is one method. Now what is the problem in this data binding technique? In this interpolation, what is the problem? In this interpolation, the problem with this interpolation is, observe carefully here. That is, we are using interpolation technique. Now see, the problem here is this. Okay, it is working. Now, is this title a part of data definition? Is the title a part of data definition? So it is not a part of data definition. It is inside data definition. It is inside data definition. Data definition just used as a container. Data definition used as a container. So this title is not binded with definition. That means it is not binded with element. It is just only defined inside the element. It is not binded with the element. It is just defined inside that element. So that means now this title, ID, price, they are not binded with this. If they are not binded with that element, lot of issues will come. So what kind of issues will come? Various types of issues will come if it is not binded. For example, now see here. Suppose data definition, okay. Let's put a text box. I will put here a text box. That means I will say product name. Let's put a text box. Input type is equal to text. Now in the text box, I want to display this name. In the text box, if I have to display the name, then see what I am doing here. Here, in a text box to display name, I know you think you know HTML. In HTML, which attribute is used to display some value in text box? Value in text box. For that you have a value. Text box have value. Placeholder is not value, right? Placeholder is only watermark text. Value. That means we have to bind that to value. Now in value, you are using a binding expression. You are using a binding expression. You are using the binding expression. In this binding expression, you are accessing, what is it? Product dot price. Binding expression, we are using product dot price. That means an expression is used for this particular value. Now what happens is, you can see that it is displayed. I am binding price or I am binding title. It will get that and it will display inside it. That is good. It is working fine. But this leads to lot of injection attacks. Injection attacks means don't use any expressions for values. If you use an expression, this expression can do lot of manipulations. An expression can do lot of manipulations. That means, for example, if it is product dot price, right? Actually, that is, you may be thinking that it is only displaying price, but actually I can put some manipulations. Means into two. I am doing some manipulations, then what happens? It will perform that manipulation. Allowing manipulations in data binding is always dangerous because it leads to injection attacks. That means anybody hacking people will first do this. That means people who are trying to hack your application, they will check where you are allowing expression. And there they pass their expressions dynamically. That affects your application. This leads to a lot of injection attacks and it is not safe. So if you are simply displaying in a literal like a div or a span without any much manipulations, then better go with interpolation. But if you have to bind with, you have to bind with any property of that control, then don't use this interpolation. What you have to do is you have to use property binding technique. You have to use property binding technique. Property binding technique is nothing but if this is a property, value is a property, right? What we have to do is, so we have to define the property in a square brace. In a square brace, we have to write the property. What is the property? Value. And to that property, so this is the property. Currently value is empty. Nothing is there. To value, what you want to display? Product dot title. I am not using any expression. Without expression, bind it. If you start writing expressions, they lead to lot of injection attacks, lot of issues. So now without expression, you can bind by using property binding technique. You see now it is going to display that. That is good. This is the best way of binding. That means bind to the properties by using this. For example, now tell me how to bind this ID to data definition. Is data definition having value? Is data definition is having value? No, data definition is not having value. Is div having a value? Div is not having value. Then how to display in div? How to display in data definition? You learned in JavaScript to display in div, to display in span, to display in table cell. You have a property called square brace. You have a property called inner HTML. You remember? Inner HTML is a property which is used to bind data to divs, spans, data definitions, table cells and all. To this inner HTML, you see I'm using inner HTML. To that inner HTML, we have to bind, what is it? Product.id. Product.id. Now it can able to get that and display. This time we are not using expression. We are using property binding. Here, instead of inner HTML, I am using here another inner text. Inner text. Product.title. I am displaying inner text. It is working fine. I hope you know the difference. What is the difference between inner HTML, inner text in JavaScript? Inner HTML will allow formats. Inner text will not allow formats. Inner text is used for displaying plain text. And inner HTML can display with formats. So this is called property binding. This is called property binding. So we have interpolation and we have property binding. So if you are not binding with any element, you are just trying to display some value in your HTML page, you go with interpolation. If you are binding with any particular element, then you have to go with property binding. This is the best way, the property binding. So here another technique. This is interpolation, and another option we have property binding. Property binding. So what happens in this technique? In this technique, the data is binded. The data is binded. The data is binded to any element by using its property. In this technique, the data is binded to any element by using its property. So that means, for example, we can have property like value. So you can have into that, you can put something. You have property like disabled. Into that, you can put some value. You have property like, suppose I want to apply some class. Now, you know this point. Class is not available as a property. Property is class name. I hope you know it. Huh? You learned JavaScript. In JavaScript, how to apply a class to element. To apply a CSS class to element, we don't have the property class. Class is used by name, class name. If it is an image, you can use src. Right? If it is an anchor, you can use href. Dynamical values you can send into them by using property binding technique. The properties are defined in a square brace and configured. That means same example, only the difference is now we made some changes. Where we made changes, data binding dot component dot HTML. In HTML, we are using property binding. Let's put property binding everywhere. Here we are using inner HTML is equal to, this is product dot what price. All these details are displayed here. How to bind with text box, images and all I will show you. We will see that. This is basic point, right? How we can display the content. I will copy this and I will put that here. This is the same. But this time we are using which technique? This time we are using property binding. But property binding have one problem. Because you learnt in HTML that every element attribute is not available as property. That is another problem. For example, I hope you learnt your HTML very well about this because these are important things. Suppose in HTML, you learnt table. Can you tell me some table attributes? What attributes table is having? Table is having attribute like border. Table is having frame. It is having rules. It is having width. It is having height. It is having some, we have right cell spacing, cell padding. So many are there, na? Right? We have table height, table width, table border and all these things. Do you know table have a attribute called height? Height is not available. Height is not available as property. It is available only as attribute. It is available only as attribute. What does that mean? It means that in HTML you can write height. But if through JavaScript, if I want to apply height for table, there is no height. Through JavaScript, if I want to apply height for table, there is no height option for table. Table have width, table don't have height. Then how we apply? For example, I hope you know that actually. Suppose you see this is index. Yeah. A page. I'll show this is demo page. Okay. See, suppose I hope you already know that here I am not writing anything. I'm cleaning up. Okay. See, there is table. When we are designing table, we have tr, td, some name, something is there inside this table. We have this table name. For table, what I am giving border as 1. So that is working fine. For table, I am giving width is equal to 300. Width is also working fine. For table, I am giving height is equal to 200. Height is also working fine. But actually, table don't have height to control dynamically. Width is there. Height is not there. I will show you that. Now let's see. Through JavaScript, if I want to apply height for table. Through JavaScript, I want to apply height for this table. That means I want to define height for table. I will show you here. I will write a simple logic for var item for var property. Let's me create a table first for you. All this not required, simple. Let's create a script var table is equal to document dot create element. I am creating a table for you dynamically. Means through JavaScript we are creating table. And for var property in table, we are reading every property of table and we are printing the property. I am printing every property of table available. You see now, I will run this. Every property, these are all table properties. These are all table properties. I written a logic to return all the table related properties. And you see, it is returning all table properties. So many are there. Let's search in these properties. Control F. Control F is for searching. In the properties, we will search for the properties. Control F here. I am searching for, so height. I am searching for width. You see, width is there. We have width. Width is there. Some offset width is there. Client width, scroll width. 3 options are there. 4 options are there. Let's search for border. Border is also there. Let's search for cell spacing. Cell spacing is also there. Let's search for height. Height is not there. We have offset height. We have scroll height. We have client height. But height is not available as property. That means every HTML element, it is having attributes, but properties are not available for them. Some properties are missing. Then generally what JavaScript people do, by using CSS, they apply those properties. That means style. By using style, they apply border, colors, backgrounds, and all these things, height and everything. Because CSS allows to apply height, width, everything. So generally what JavaScript developers do, they use styles for applying the height dynamically. So what is the point here? The point is very simple. I will give here a simple design. Let's remove this. I will create a table. And for table, I am giving table row and table cell. In that we have name and we have some price, something. This is in Angular I am designing. We have name and price. Okay. Now one more what we are doing here is, for this table, I am giving some values. You see, here I will create some properties now. So I will create here table border. Table border is a property. It is what type? Suppose number type, and into that I will put 2. Or table border is 1. Okay. Similarly, I will give table width. Table width, it is also a number. I will give 300. Now I will give table height. Table height is also a number. I will give as 200. Now let's apply this. Let's apply these values to table. How to bind these values to table? Let's go. Table, for table, I am giving one property. What is the property? Border. Border is coming from which reference? Table border. We will access the table border. And you see now, the table is applied with border. Table is applied with border. So border we are applying through logic, right? Right. Now next, one more property. What is it? Width. From where to get it? Table width. Table width. You see, width is also affected. Let's apply height. I am writing here height, and is equal to, what is it? Table height. Table height. Now it is not working. You see, interestingly, it says that cannot bind to height because it is not a property of table. But in HTML, you have used it. It's working in HTML, but it is not working here. Right? That's what you learned in HTML and JavaScript, that HTML have attributes, JavaScript will have properties. Every attribute is not available as property. Some attributes are available as properties, but their names will be different. Like class, here we use class name, right? And some spellings will change, capitalization will change, the way of style of defining will change. So some attributes of HTML elements are not available as properties. Then how you will apply? I want height. But Angular is saying that I don't know height because there is no height for table dynamically. That means now we have to tell Angular that this is not a property, it is an attribute. You bind to attribute, not to the property. Then we have to use attr.height. This tells Angular that this is not property, this is an attribute. Then Angular will bind to HTML attributes. Now I will save this. Now you can see it is working fine. Otherwise, it will show an error. So can I bind everything to property? Not possible. Why you need attribute binding? You need attribute binding because some elements related attributes are not available as properties. If they are not available as properties, then you have to directly bind to attribute only. Then how do we tell Angular that I am not binding to your property, I am binding to attribute? You have to use attr. So this is called attribute binding. So why you need attribute binding? Attribute binding. That means here every HTML element attribute is not available as property. That means you cannot bind any dynamic data. So to bind any dynamic data, you have to configure as attribute. So as attribute, that means suppose we have height. So this is table na. Let me put the table, yeah, right. Table, and I given height is equal to some value. I given some number, just roughly I'm giving. Height is 200, like this, I am binding some. Actually we get from dynamic, what is it? Table height. So this is invalid. It will not work because table don't have any height property. Then what we have to do? For table, we have to define attr. What is it? Height. In that we have to define table height. That is what we have to do. This is valid. This is how we define. So when to use interpolation, when to use property binding, and when to use attribute binding. So which one is best? There is nothing like that. It depends on situation. We use all three because sometimes we need to bind to attribute which is not there as property. Then we have to compulsory go with attribute binding. If it is available as property, better always do property binding. So if you don't want to bind to element, you want to keep it literal in the page, then go with template binding. That is what actually we call as interpolation. Now, one problem is all these things what you have learned, they all the data binding techniques, are all the data binding techniques are one-way binding. All these are one-way binding. Now that is interpolation is one-way binding, property binding is one-way binding, attribute binding is one-way binding. One-way binding means they will bring the data and present in the UI. But when you make any change in UI, it will not reflect back. Then no use. That means I am showing in a text box and I should allow to change the text box. That means we get value from and display in a text box. When user makes any changes, it should update back. But these all three techniques can't do. That means all these three techniques that you have learned, they are one-way binding. They are not two-way binding techniques. That is problem. All these are one-way binding. One-way binding means they can access and display. For example, just rough point, one point I will tell here. Later we will discuss about data binding. You see, here we have so product name and input type is equal to text. And here we will display a property called product name, and it is a string type and it is some TV. And what I am defining here, we are binding to what? Value, and for value we are displaying product name. Whatever product name is there, we are binding it. And here we will put in a line break. Name, we will use interpolation. What is it? Product name. You see, we are just displaying like this. Now here we have TV. Now if I make any change, it should reflect here. Am I right? If I make any change here, it should update back. Now I am making change. It is not updating. It is not updating back. If it is updating back, it should automatically change this one. Right? It is not updating back. That means it is only one direction. Get the data and show. Any changes you make inside it, they are not updated. Any changes you make inside it, they are not updated back. For that, we need a technique called two-way binding. This is one-way binding. Now we need to learn how to handle two-way binding. That means access the data and show, identify the changes and update back. This is called two-way binding technique. How the two-way binding works is the important part that we'll see in next session. Tomorrow we will do that. Right? In tomorrow's session, we will see two-way binding. One-way binding, how many methods are there? 3. Interpolation, property binding, attribute binding. What is difference? You saw that. Now we have to see how to handle two-way binding. Then we can design the forms and work with them. Tomorrow we will see that. Okay? Right.